Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. Welcome to the Deck Tech series. This will cover the builds of my own personal decks. I change my decks fairly often and have all of them listed on deckstats.com, so if you're interested in seeing the most current version or look ahead to other decks, you can find me there under Green Magic, and there's a direct link in the description. Each deck will be featured in two parts. The first video to each deck tech will show all 100 cards contained in the deck, prices for those cards, and some insight for the interactions between cards. It's important when building a deck to have goals, restrictions, and themes, so I'll be sure to cover where the decks are coming from. The second video for each commander will be about changes and alterations you could make to the deck. Personalizing your decks is important to most players, so if you like a commander and want to build it yourself, I'm including several recommendations for you to make the deck your own. Alright, welcome to part 2 of deck number 2 in the Deck Tech series. So this is about Freyalise. Part 1 told you all about my deck, and now this is part 2 for Freyalise, which will just talk about some alternatives that you could throw into the deck. Just a quick overview on what is in the deck. It has 35 lands, 0 creature cards, 8 artifacts, 18 enchantments, 4 instants, 24 sorceries, 11 planeswalkers. The only numbers that are super relevant there are the 0 creatures, which is the defining characteristic of this deck. And then planeswalkers, I did kind of play up that theme a little bit. I would not describe it as being a Super Friends or planeswalker-centric deck, but that is something that is prevalent. So the value of my deck is $527.01. A big part of this suggestion video will be in ways to make it more budget and bring that cost down. It will not be a true budget deck in the Commander Quarters sense, but it will be much more reasonable and in more of a mid-range. The restrictions that I have in my deck is nothing is infinite. It does not have infinite card draw, infinite tokens, infinite mana, anything like that. And none of the suggestions that I include in this video break that. There are a few things that you could do to make the deck infinite, but I'm not even going to touch on that, at least today. There are more. I do have infinite decks. They are coming up soon, but this one just doesn't touch on it. Like I mentioned, it is important that this deck has no creatures, and I'm not even going to change that for the suggestions. I'm sure you can think of at least a few utility creatures that you would want in a green deck just in general. It's not even worth including it here because it follows the theme pretty strictly on that. Everything makes tokens, or tokens are sort of how you get your board state and where you take the deck to win. So there are a few suggestions on token makers in this video. And then you try to win through combat damage primarily. I will just mention a couple of brief alternate win cons, but also some ways to buff up your combat damage. So real quick, let's look at the cards from the last video that were kind of expensive, the things that you would most likely take out if you are being budget conscious. Over $50, you've got Scroll Wreck, Doubling Season, and Extraplanar Lens. Over $30, you've got Mana Reflection, Primal Vigor, Parallel Lives. Over $20, you've got Chroma's Memorial, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, and Gauntlet of Power. And then still over $10, Freyalise Llanowar's Fury. That's the commander, so you can't take her out. You're going to have to leave her in. Azuri's Predation and Nissa, Voice of Zendikar. I believe, as I pointed out in the other video, the only reason why that one is almost $12 is because mine's foil. I didn't go out of my way to make it a foil. I'm not foil-centric, but the normal version is only like $1.50. These 12 cards do add up to over $400, so taking them out would go a long way towards bringing down that total cost. Then there are 6 more cards that are over $5, Triumph of the Hordes, Caged Sun, Awakening Zone, Saproling Symbiosis, Garruk Wildspeaker, and Rishkar's Expertise. The one that is easiest to just take out is Triumph of the Hordes. There are other pump spells. Awakening Zone's not critical or super important either from a token or ramp standpoint. Caged Sun's pretty good. Garruk Wildspeaker, it actually does help a little bit with ramp, and Rishkar's Expertise. I would say is great card draw, but most of the creatures do tend to at least start out small. They might get bigger if you pump them through various effects. Even Cage Sun gives your creatures +1/+1. But the thing that makes it good too is that even if you only draw 3-4 cards off of it, you still get to turn around and free cast a 5 CMC thing. So it kind of ends up being 1 mana to draw a few cards, and then you just cast some other smaller thing. So that one's a little bit sad to see it go if you have to take it out for budget reasons. But let's start just focusing on what the actual alternatives are. So from the mana side of things, there are a couple of budget mana doublers. Heartbeat of Spring, this one, it only costs 3 mana, and it's just over $1. Whenever a player taps a land for mana, that player adds 1 mana of any type that land produced. So this one will apply to non-basic lands as well, but it also affects your opponents. This one is really, it hurts to put it down on turn 3 because you're giving everyone else access to the extra mana before you even get to it. If you put it down on 7 or 8, like maybe you have 10 lands in play, so you tap 3 of them for this, your remaining 7 lands tap for 2 now, that at least feels a lot better and easier to parlay it into a good position. But as a budget card and as just a strong card in general, it's definitely worth including. I shy away from it because I would rather just have the better effects. Another thing worth pointing out, though, too, is that even though it is a symmetrical effect that'll help your opponents, so long as you are in green and running all of those effects that get you more lands into play, your opponents might have 6 lands that tap for 2, you might have 15 lands that tap for 2. So it's never truly symmetrical. Dictate of Karametra at 5 mana is basically the same thing. It is a symmetrical effect. It does help your opponents. However, it has flash, so you at least have the option, if you leave up 5 mana and then you pass turn and you wait for the end step before your turn, flash it out. That way, at least your opponents don't benefit off of it before you do. But if you don't win on that next turn, your opponents will benefit off of it. Next are a couple of things that will ramp you in other ways. Emerald Medallion. This is a card that, because I have so many things, I don't include it because I have so many things that get extra lands into play. I'm land ramping, and I have mana doublers, more things that care about lands, and a lot of the planeswalkers untap lands. They care about lands. This one is just a discounter, but it is super good in the deck for a few reasons. One, it's 2 mana, so if it's in your opening hand, you get it out early. A lot of the time, you're not going to have a turn 2 play in this deck. The deck generally doesn't start at all till turn 3. So it gives you a turn 2 play. It affects basically everything in the deck because there's only a few colorless artifacts spells in the deck. I think there's like 5. And of all the green spells, only I think one of them, Night Soil, doesn't have any generic mana cost in it. So this will affect 58 out of 64 of the other spells in the deck or something to that effect. So it will generate you a ton of value. But it's not on the super budget end of the spectrum. So very good. Definitely worth something worth considering. But I don't, and I probably should. If you want to power up the deck, that would be a smart inclusion. Journey of Discovery. So I am not including all of the other potential mana ramp things. You may have noticed that the deck does not include things like Rampant Growth or anything else. I don't even think it has Explosive Vegetation. I recently took that out for the new one, the one that you can cycle. So I'm not going to include all of the other ramp spells that you could put in. The reason why I am singling out this card is because you have the option. So suppose you're at the point where you've drawn a bunch of cards. You now have the option of using the mode on this card where you just take 2 extra lands from your hand and put them into play. Which, if your lands tap for 2 or 3 mana, that actually does ramp you within the same turn. So ramp within a turn, think of that as being like a ritual effect. It's not like a Signet or even Rampant Growth or Cultivate where you're ramping for later by having the lands come into play tapped. This is something that if you use that mode to it, it ramps you within that turn, just like a dark ritual. Think of it that way. You pay 3, you put 2 lands into play. If those lands add up to 4 or 6 or 8 mana or whatever, you ramp by that much. Also, it's very handy if earlier in the turn you need to play your land for turn, your forest, and then later you draw the Nykthos. You really want to get that Nykthos in play, so the ability to put extra lands out is very helpful there too. And you do have sort of that backup emergency worst case scenario where if on turn 3 you don't have any other ramp spells, then on turn 4 you don't even draw a land, so you cast this for the other half where you just search for 2 basic lands, and then you don't miss a land drop. It prevents you from falling behind. Next are a few of the card draw cards. Explore. This is one that I generally don't highly prioritize, but it is very generically good because it's so low on the mana curve. It does give you that early play. Again, it's only 2 mana, which I don't use a whole lot of. And it allows you to play an additional land, which, again, if it's like turn 2 and you happen to have a few extra lands in your hand, it will ramp you. And if you do it on turn 7, 8, whatever, your lands at that point probably tap for 2 or 3 mana each, so it's going to pay for itself or ramp you ahead. And if you've already played a forest as your land for turn and you draw Nykthos, then this is another redundant way to make sure that you get it in play. Endless Atlas is a card that I had in the deck a while back. I took it out in favor of other things, other card draw, I guess. I don't remember specifically what I traded, but it is very good in that it is, again, something you can play on turn 2, and it is something that if you maybe hit, so long as you hit your land drop on turn 3, forest, no Nykthos, if you have nothing else to do, you can just tap it and draw a card and kind of keep up. But it does become sort of a dead card later. Once you're on your big explosive turn, if you're starting to stumble, this gives you a chance to pay 2 to put it in play, pay 2 to tap it, and then you can dig 1 card deeper, but it's not going to be super useful there. Its ceiling is kind of low, which is why I took it out. Elemental Bond, this is one that will just draw you a card every time a creature with power 3 or greater ETBs. So again, with all of the tokens, most of them are pretty small and would by themselves be too small to draw you a card with this. However, with all of the Anthem effects and other buffs, you could basically draw a card off of every little elf druid that comes into play. The reason why I kind of shy away from it, and I kind of feel hesitant even including the Garruk's Uprising or whatever the name of the card that is in the deck, is that it's not a May. So if you do have those Anthem effects out and you play something that gives you like 20 tokens or more, say you have something that doubles the amount of tokens in play, but you've also got a doubling season in play. So you go from 20, you would gain 40 more, which would force you to draw 40 cards off Elemental Bond. Maybe you've only got 35 cards in the deck. So it could even stifle you from playing those other cards, and maybe you need to play those other cards to win. So it could actually hold you back in some cases, which is one thing that, I'm hesitant with the Garruk's, the new one that is in the deck. I don't know that I would want too many of these in there just to be on the safe side. More card draw. You got Sylvan Library. This one again was in the deck at one previous time. I took it out because I only have, I think, 3 copies of Sylvan Library, and I wanted it in a different deck. This one is very helpful in the very early game. Like if it's in your opening hand, you have 2 lands in this, you can keep that and be pretty safe because it means that on turn 3, you would have drawn 5 total cards. Your draw for 1, 2, and then the 3 cards on turn 3. So you're almost guaranteed to have hit a land. You'll probably hit like a Cultivator Kadama's Reach so that you can start accelerating. It, again, is a 2-drop, so it gives you something to do in the early game. And if, suppose you have only 2 lands and then this, and you don't hit a land, pay the 8 life, take the extra 2 cards on turn 3 this is, and then discard 2 cards. Sadly, you paid 8 life and discarded 2, but you've dug that much deeper so that you can get unmana screwed a few turns faster. So it does provide that that safety net that a lot of other decks won't have. I'm sure you've seen, if you've played enough Commander, you've seen a lot of instances where someone, they get their, their first 2 lands out, their first couple of turns, and then they don't draw a land for like 6 straight turns, and they never get back into the game. Sylvan Library can help to prevent that from happening to you. Abundance is the card that pairs very well with Sylvan Library because it says that instead of drawing a card, you replace that with revealing cards off the top of your library till you hit either land or non-land, depending on which one you choose, and then you put that into your hand. So that pairs well with Sylvan Library because instead of drawing the 3 cards, you use Abundance's replacement effect. That way you get to keep all 3, and you get a choice, lands or non-lands or a combination. So you get exactly what you want, and it doesn't cost you 8 life. They're a great combo. They go well together. When you take out Sylvan Library, there's no point in having Abundance for the most part. And so they both came out at the same time when I built it in my deck. The next couple of cards in the card draw category, Life's Legacy and Momentous Fall, both of them require you to sacrifice a creature and then you draw based on its power. I am generally not a huge fan of sacking my own creatures because everything in this deck is token based. It doesn't really cost you that much. You're just sacrificing a token that you can make more of, and they're not super important. So these actually do work pretty well in the deck. The only downside is that, again, these ones care about the power of the creature, which most of the tokens, at least starting out, are 3 power or less, so they don't draw you a bunch of cards. The best card draw in the deck is going to be things that care about how many creatures you have, because you're going to be much more capable of going wide than going tall. But the deck does contain several things that can pump up either a single creature or the whole team, and if you have enough of those in play, you can get a big creature that will draw you a bunch of cards off these. And they are, because they sacrifice the creature as an additional cost, these ones, from the go tall standpoint, are much cheaper on the mana curve. Life's Legacy only costs 2, whereas Soul's Majesty and Return of the Wild Speaker, they cost 5 and 6 mana. So very good from that standpoint as well. There are some buffs that would go well in the deck. The deck contains 5, not counting all the things that Planeswalkers can do. Buffs tend to be very cheap, like dollar-wise in money, so they are definitely friendly for budget players, and these ones will definitely help you towards that. Also, the fact that you are going wide and creating a bunch of tokens, these ones do make a lot of sense to include in the deck. Stampede is one that you probably don't see very often at all. It is 3 mana. It gives all of attacking creatures trample and +1/+0 till on a turn. Now, one thing worth pointing out on this is because it specifies attacking creatures, it means that you can't cast this during main phase 1 and still have that effect. They are not attacking creatures at that point. You would have to do it during the combat phase, either after attackers are declared or after blockers are declared. Presumably after blockers are declared would be the best time. But if you cast it during main phase 1, they are not attacking creatures at that point, so it does nothing. One thing worth pointing out too is that it does not say yours. So you could, if you want, just for a goof, to cast, if you have one opponent attacking a different opponent and they're threatening a good amount of damage, cast this on their stuff and deal more damage to the second guy. especially if that happens to be, infect and they're only blocking 9 of it. This will give you they would only take 9 of it. So this would give them that 10th one. Or commander damage, if their commander would just barely hit 20 and so the defender thinks they're safe. Here's a way to pump that up to make it lethal. And if you pull off that trick, that would be kind of funny and a story to remember. Vitalizing Wind, this one is very expensive on the mana curve. It's 9 mana, but it does give all creatures you control +7/+7 until end of turn. So both of these are instants. The other ones are going to be sorceries. So these are the only 2 that you could cast during combat. The main reason that you would want to cast either of them, although Stampede does not work, during main phase 1 is if, suppose you've tapped your lands and you have like 3 mana left over from, just floating. And the only way that you would get up to 9 is you would need to tap 1 or 2 other lands to get up there. If you wait till you go to combat and those 3 floating mana go away, you would not be able to produce enough mana to pay the 9. Then you would have to cast this during main phase 1 because of any residual floating mana. With Vitalizing Wind, you can do that. Just play it at sorcery speed. Stampede, you can't really do that. You would have to wait till you're in combat. But again, because it's only 3 mana, the likelihood that you would be able to during main phase 1 due to residual mana, but not in combat after that goes away, less likely. Vitalizing Wind is just so expensive on the mana curve, though. It's hard to justify. I mean, it's pretty easy to cast it. The deck does produce a ton of mana, but it is a little bit more of a hindrance. The next 3 buffs are kind of more the standard things that just kind of are more straightforward, I guess. Overwhelm, this one, it says it costs 7 mana, but then when you read the text box, it basically says that it's free. You just tap 7 of your creatures that are summoning sick, or even if your whole team has haste, you just tap 7 weak guys that you don't care about. And then your whole team gets +3/+3 till end of turn. The actual casting cost on that's just what kind of makes me hesitant to want to include it. But it's not the hindrance that it might appear to be. It's actually basically a free spell. Overwhelming Stampede. This is one that you probably see a lot in Commander, or at least a reasonable amount. If you see a pump spell of this nature, it's usually going to be Overwhelming Stampede, because it just gives your whole team trample, which is the important thing, and then +X/+X where it's your biggest creature. And usually if you're playing a pump spell, you're going to have at least one giant, 7, 8, 10, 20 power creature. Clothy's Design is one that gets no attention, and I don't know how. Theros Beyond Death was a set that just came out earlier this year, and I would think that when people are looking at the new cards, they're looking at the set, what's in it, they would see something like this and it'd be like, oh my god, that is massive. Your creatures get +X/+X on a turn where X is your devotion to green. Now obviously if you're playing a 4 or 5 color deck, if you're playing a deck that's not combat centric, this card doesn't do much for you. You would stay away from it. But if you're playing even a 2 or 3 color deck that has a lot of green creatures, even if this just gives your team +4/+4, it's not terrible value, 6 mana +4/+4 for all your creatures. But realistically, this thing is going to pump your team up by 15 plus, +15 for 20 creatures. Pretty good value. The only thing it doesn't give you is trample, which if you're in a position where you only have a few creatures that aren't summoning sick, that's a bit of a problem. If you've got your 30, 40, 50, 100 plus creatures, it doesn't matter. Your opponents aren't going to be able to block all of them. So having 20, 15 power creatures get through is going to be just fine. Next, still in the buffs category, Titania's Boom. This one, Boon, sorry, not Boom. It puts a 1/1 counter on each creature you control, and then the next one, Wild Onslaught, puts a 1/1 counter on each creature you control, or you can pay twice the cost to put 2 1/1 counters. So these ones are very good synergy with things that care about the counters, primarily Doubling Season and the Primal Vigor, if those are out, this can put out, 2 1/1 counters, or 4 1/1 counters, or 8 if you have both of those plus Mirage Mirror. 8 1/1 counters on each creature you control. It does scale up very well. Or worst case scenario, 4 mana to give your creatures +1/+1. Not telling a turn, but permanently. It's pretty good value, pretty good way to help your team out. Then scale up. This one, I'm including it here as a team-wide buff to make your whole team 6/4s, which is generally going to buff up most of them. Some of them are 1/1s, and this is a big buff. Some of them are 3/3s, and this is like a medium buff. But you could always use this in conjunction with your draw equal to your biggest creature spells. If all you have are, like a couple 1/1 tokens, a couple 2/2 tokens, then those cards, the Rich Cards Expertise and everything, would only draw you 2. With this, you pay 1 mana, and then you'll draw 4 extra cards off of that, or whatever the scenario might be. So it's great at beefing those card draw spells up. Next, let's talk about some of the token makers. There are a couple of them that will just make you a ton of tokens all at once. Howl of the Night pack. It is high on the mana curve at 7, so that one might kind of scare you off a little bit, but so many things that get you extra lands into play, so many things that double the mana, so many things that untap your lands, planeswalkers. Mana is not going to be a huge issue once you get to your turns where you're really pumping stuff out. And the fact that it gives you a token for every forest you control, again, this is why the deck cares about basic lands over non-basics, and this is you're playing plenty of those spells that put extra lands into play. This just goes very well with everything that you're doing. Spontaneous Generation, this one gives you a 1/1 Saproling for each card in your hand, which, if you're not doing much in a standard game, maybe you have 3 to 6 cards in your hand. When you're playing green, and especially this deck, you're often going to have somewhere between 15 and 65 cards in your hand. So yeah, you'll be creating a lot of Saprolings once you're at the point in the game where you're really doing big things. The next few, Wolfcaller's Howl, this was in the deck. I believe this was a more recent thing that I took out in favor of something better. It just gives you a wolf token during your upkeep, where it's the number of cards, based on the number of cards in your opponent's hand. I think in the past when this has been in play and it's kind of come up, I generally get 1 or 2, so it does seem to perform a little bit weaker than what you would hope. The main downside to it, though, is that it happens during your upkeep, so if you're in your big turn, your big play, where you're trying to just create tokens and you're trying to get tokens in play before you ult Freyalise or whatever the scenario might be, this doesn't contribute to that, so it's too slow to help you pop off. Vernon Embrace, this is one that I've, again, taken out recently, but it was in the deck. I don't like it for the reason that it is slow. This one will give you a Saproling token on each upkeep, so in 1 turn rotation, you get 4 Saprolings, which is good value, and does, beef up your board in the way that you would think the deck wants, but it doesn't give you anything immediately. The fact that it buffs up the creature that it's attached to can really help with those things that draw you cards based off how big your creature is. The downside to it, though, is that because it's attached to a creature, it's a aura. If the creature dies, if there's like a board wipe or something, you actually lose this. And a big part of what the deck is trying to do, the main reason that the deck was built in the first place, was to avoid board wipes hurting me. So this one, it kind of goes against that. But it is fairly cheap, and it does provide some strength and value to it. Snake Pit is another one that I think I took out quite a while ago. This one gives you a 1/1 snake every time one of your opponents plays a blue or black spell. Usually you'll have at least a couple opponents playing one of those colors. So you will generate value off of it. The thing is that it doesn't help you immediately during your big explosive turn. And so unless you get it out on turn 4, in which case you're not ramping at that point, it's just not going to really justify its spot. But it is kind of a medium power card. It is something your people don't see very often, so you could, and it is budget, so you could include it for several reasons. It just isn't powerful enough for me. The next few are things that, well, Reach of Branches is something that I think I took out fairly recently, and I've been wanting to. I'm hesitant to do that just because I really want this card to play this card. I want it to work and I want to do something with it. What makes it good is that every time a force enters the battlefield under your control, you return it from your graveyard to your hand. So you cast it, it goes to your graveyard, you play your land for turn, you get it back, you cast it again, you maybe cultivate, that land will enter the battlefield tapped, this returns to your hand, you cast it again. I like the fact that it gives you recurable value. And even if you have to discard it to hand size, it's in the graveyard, later, 2-3 turns later, you play your land for turn, you get it back. Also the fact that it's at instant speed. The fact that the token it makes has a big butt. It's a 2/5. It's a good blocker. I want it to be good. It's a card that usually I look at as being a dead card. It's not the thing. If I've got 20 cards in my hand, this is like the last thing that I'm looking at casting. Birthing, I don't even know how to pronounce that. Bows? I want to say burrow, but there's no R. This one is just a way where you can each turn make a token. It's a colorless shapeshifter, so if any of your opponents are doing any kind of tribal things, you could also benefit off of that, technically. The reason that I would suggest it is just because it is something that you can do every turn, so this is more if you're trying to play at a little bit lower, a little bit weaker, more casual level, where you can just keep the game going for a long time. The way I built my deck is more explosive, and you just hit that big turn where you cast a bunch of stuff, draw a bunch of stuff, cast more stuff, and then say I win. Birthing bows or whatever would be much better for kind of the long game. Sword of Body and Mind, again, this is one that I had and I just very recently took out. It gives your creature +2/+2, pro green, pro blue. When it deals combat damage to a player, you make a 2/2 wolf token, and then they mill 10. So, buffing the creature, again, helps with the card draw cards that care about how big your thing is. The protection, I guess, could help for making it harder to block or, depending on what your opponent has, unblockable. The mill 10 isn't particularly relevant, but it was in the deck to make a token. The reason that I took this out is the same idea as the previous one, the Verdant Embrace, is that if the creature it's attached to dies, then you just lost the value of it. With the aura would go to the graveyard. With this one, it just becomes unequipped. But still, that means that you have to pay 2 mana to equip it to a different creature, and that kind of feels like you're now taking a step back and wasting mana, and it was something that fits with the deck. It just doesn't quite do it in the way that I want my deck to perform. Now, in the actual deck, you saw there was the Spider Silk Armor. It gives your creatures +0/+1 and reach. That is a good way to help deal with flyers so that you can block them to protect your planeswalkers. If you want more effects that are anti-flyer, there are 3 that I think go pretty well. Raking Canopy. This one says, whenever a creature with flying attacks you, this deals 4 damage to that creature. So unless the thing attacking you is like a 5/5, 6/6, whatever, and or indestructible, this will just shoot it out of the sky. So if they attack you with a 3/3 flyer, pop, it's dead. And no damage is dealt to my planeswalker, because it deals the damage on attack. So no blockers are declared, no combat damage happens, it's already dead. Gravity Well is a way to say that whenever a creature with flying attacks, it loses flying. So it basically gives everything reach in a sense, because the flyers no longer have flying. So they are blockable by non-flyers. Now, if you happen to have one of those cards that say like destroy target creature with flying, because the creature loses flying until end of turn, you wouldn't be able to use a spell like that after this effect happens, but that's usually not going to be relevant. And then finally, Crosswinds just says all creatures with flying get -2/-0. So this doesn't stop them from attacking you, but it means that the 1 or 2 power flyer just does no damage to your planeswalkers or you. If it has 3 power, it only does 1. You get the idea. It just weakens them enough to not to kind of save your planeswalkers. Next are just some of the random things that kind of help your team. They're not team buffs in the sense that they are like overrun effects, but Concordant Crossroads, it gives your creatures haste. It gives all creatures haste. This applies to every player. It's a very good card, and I would generally say it goes hand in hand with Akroma's Memorial as basically the only two permanents that will give your entire team haste. I just didn't really find room for it in my deck. I don't feel that, even though the deck is almost entirely combat based and does explode and needs to kind of do everything all in one turn, which makes this a very good choice for the deck, I've just kind of stepped back on that. And really, if I was going to include more things to kind of help close the game out, I would go with more alternate win condition type things. And there are plenty of them. I'm only going to mention a couple in this video, but Concordant Crossroads is a very good choice if you choose to put that in. Primal Rage, this just gives all your stuff trample. You have plenty of planeswalkers that are able to do it, even if you would rather choose their other modes at the time. You have plenty of those pump spells that help with trample. And then you only have that one Garruk's, I want to say it's Uprising, the thing that gives all your stuff trample and draws you cards when creatures with power 3 or greater ETB. That new card, which I believe is from the recent Core 21 set, it basically takes the old Primal Rage and then staples Elemental Bond onto it. Elemental Bond plus Primal Rage equals that new one. And I knew that right when the card came out, it was very clear on what it was doing, and it was doing it better than these old ones do. This would be something that you would include in the deck as a redundant effect to the new Garruk's Uprising and Elemental Bond. The main reason that I wouldn't include it is just running out of room. Then there's Bull of Nylea. This one can help you. It gives your stuff Death Touch, which means that if you haven't given them trample, it just makes your opponents kind of pay for choosing to block them. Even if you haven't pumped up any of your creatures, like you just have 31 ones, no trample, nothing. If they all have Death Touch, your opponent's going to pay for everything that they try to block and kill. If your stuff does have trample, suppose they're like 4 or 5, power, they only have to deal 1 damage to each creature that blocks them. So even if your opponent has like 5 creatures with a total 30 toughness on them, they're only blocking 5 damage and losing all 5 creatures, assuming they're not indestructible. So it can really help you with getting through and actually finishing people off. But it does so in a way that if you've got 200 tokens in play, all with haste, and they're all 10, 20, 30 power, at that point, stuff like this doesn't even matter. It's more for the kind of like just getting it by a hair. Now, the activated abilities on this, putting a 1/1 counter on a single creature, not super relevant unless you have the doubling effects out. Dealing 2 damage to a flyer, probably not super relevant. You could either bolt a bird before you attack or, whatever, or after, you've attacked and they've chosen to block with it, if 2 more damage would kill it. But then again, if that's the case, if they took damage with it, then that means that they blocked one of your death touchers. So maybe if they block a different opponent and it has damage marked on it, but 2 more damage would kill it, you could bolt a bird that way. Gaining 3 life is not usually super relevant. This deck doesn't have a whole lot of life gain, doesn't care about it. But the last ability of taking 4 cards from your graveyard and putting them on the bottom of your library, that's a little bit of recursion that it can give you for any kind of planeswalkers or something else that you might want to get back. I don't play a whole lot of graveyard recursion, but in the previous video I did point out the couple of ways that the deck had, which was the 6 mana ramp spell. I can't think of what it's called off the top of my head. And then also the Nissa that allows you to get a permanent. So those 2 were pretty much it. This would at least, but those return it to your hand. This would return something to your library, but with all the card draw, you would be able to get to it anyway, if you're pretty well set up, but you really want those cards. The next couple are more of that recursion stuff. And there are definitely plenty more graveyard recursion spells. There's, the 2 mana one that'll just straight give you something from your graveyard to hand. But at least with these ones, they're not really targeting a single thing. It's more of a wholesale value of, in Seasons Past case, you get 1 of each CMC to your hand. And then this goes on the bottom of your library, so you could do it again later. And then Praetor's Council returns everything from your graveyard to your hand, and it gives you no maximum hand size. So if you happen to not win, but you've already drawn 50 cards, at least you get to keep all those cards instead of not only having to throw most of them away, but having to think of which ones you want to throw away, which can be very time consuming. The next couple of cards, Broken Bond, this one, okay, I don't run a whole lot of removal in the deck. Obviously, that's something that you would probably want to include more of in yours if you care more about that, but I'm not trying to affect my opponent's board state so much in this deck, and Broken Bond is a good way to just give you that little bit of artifact and enchantment hate. But the reason that I would include it, why I mentioned this as opposed to other just removal spells, is that this allows you to put an extra land from your hand onto the battlefield, which, as I've mentioned before, if you've drawn 50 cards and you just got a ton of lands in your hand, it's nice to be able to put 1 more into play just so that you've kind of thinned your hand out a little bit. And potentially ramped. If the land taps for 2 mana, it pays for itself. If it taps for 3, 4, 5, 6, you're actually gaining mana, like a Dark Ritual effect. And if you've played your forest as your land for turn, but you've at some point finally drawn that Nykthos you've been digging for, here's a way to put the Nykthos into play. Summer Bloom, same general idea. This one allows you to play up to 3 additional lands during that turn. So Broken Bond could actually work as a good turn 2 play. If one of your opponents have played like an artifact, maybe a Soul Ring, you destroy that, and if you have a land in your hand, you put it out so that you ramp a little bit on turn 2. Summer Bloom, you would almost never play on turn 2 unless you still have 3 more lands in your hand, maybe 4 lands in your hand, because if you have exactly 3, then there's a good chance you won't top deck one on turn 3 and then make your land drop. So you're not usually ever going to play this on turn 2. It just won't do you very much. This is something that you would play during your big explosive turn once you've drawn 30, 40 cards, and this just lets you put a few more lands into play. Even if the lands only tap for 1, this costs 2, you'd gain 3. If you've got the Nykthos in your hand, this allows you to get the important land into play. And if your land's tapped for 3, 4, 5 mana, this one will Dark Ritual you, 8, 10, 20 mana, whatever crazy number it is that you gain off of it. So it's pretty valuable there. And even if you've drawn like 10 cards and you've got like 8 in hand or something, You're not going to be able to win this turn. Playing Summer Bloom and then putting 3 more lands into play at least means that you won't have to discard that turn, and you've ramped a little bit for the future. So it's generally going to perform pretty well for you. Then I mentioned some alternate win conditions before. I'll just go over a few of them. Altar the Brood. This one, every time a permanent enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent mills 1. This one is great with all the tokens because you make 50, 80, 100 tokens. That's more cards than your opponents have in their library. They mill, they lose. There are other mill effects. I don't want to go over all of them. I did make a mill video if you just want to look at that. This would just be the most effective in this or a token-based deck. Very simple, very straightforward. Epic Struggle, this is one that requires it to make it back to your upkeep. However, it could be something that you could sneak in with any of the instant speed token makers. There's only a few instants in the deck, but like one of them doubles the amount of tokens you have. That could single-handedly win you the game if you've already got 10 tokens out, or if you have like 7 tokens and a doubler. You have 7 out, you play your double tokens, but you have doubling season out, so it'll instead give you 14 for a total of 21, and then you do that during the end step before your turn. Your upkeep, you win. I think I had always considered that for this deck, but nah. And then finally, Chain Veil is the last card I want to mention, which probably should have been the first card mentioned because I brought it up a couple of times in the previous video. The deck, because it has a good number of Planeswalkers, would be pretty well affected by Chain Veil. It could really help you, but it's not something, because it's not like a pure or like entirely Super Friends Planeswalker centric deck. I don't necessarily feel the need to include it. If you don't have at least a couple of Planeswalkers out in play, it doesn't do anything. It does require you to have drawn and cast and want to activate those Planeswalkers multiple times in a single turn. So if you draw it somewhere in the middle of your big explosive turn, it's very good there, but if it's like in your opening hand or something, then it's not super effective then. But it is something that you could look at as being a good card in the deck. So let's look at everything from a budget standpoint. Let's start with the things that are over $5. There were exactly 40 cards that I've gone over in this video, of which 5 of them are more than $5. Sylvan Library, Concordant Crossroads, The Chain Veil, Sword of Body and Mind, and Emerald Medallion. All of them would help the deck. They would definitely contribute to the deck. Sylvan Library, I meant to say this when I was talking about it earlier. I kept praising it as a great early game card. But if you draw it on, turn 7 or 8, whatever turn you happen to be popping off on, at that point it just does nothing. So it is very oriented towards the early game. If you get it in the mid game and it's mid game but you haven't popped off, or there've been board wipes, there's been some control that's blown your stuff up to stop you from popping off, then you'll still get value off of it there, but its value is entirely centered on the very early game. So good card, but it's also the most expensive thing not included in the deck. That I'm also recommending here. The other ones, they certainly do offer some to the deck, but now let's talk about the ones that are more than $1, less than $5. There's 15 of them here, so a good chunk of cards kind of in that mid-budget range. You see a lot of things that you could definitely say would really help the deck out. Of the things here, I think probably the thing you would want to include most would be either Overwhelming Stampede, if you care about the combat damage, the 2 mana doublers, Heartbeat of Spring and Dictate of Karametra, because they, again, double your mana, or Altar of the Brood because it's low on the mana cost and it is very easy to mill your opponents out with so many tokens that you generate. Everything on this, though, is going to be pretty strong in the deck. And then 20 of the 40 cards that I mentioned in this video are super budget. They're under $1. Here's where most of those combat trick spells are. Also a couple of token makers that don't see a whole lot of play. Some of your flyer hate. Yeah, this is where you're going to get some of those effects, and they can actually do what they want to do pretty effectively and help out the deck quite a bit. It just, if the things you're taking out of the deck are things like Doubling Season and Primal Vigor, these don't seem like they would contribute nearly as much as what those other ones do. But in a lot of cases, having 30 creatures that are in play and able to attack versus having 120 of those same creatures that are in play and able to attack, the Doubling Season is just a clutter your playmat. Not so much does it help you win or make you win. Final thoughts, I think, would be that there are plenty. If you want to make the deck more casual and more at a friendly kitchen table type thing, then include more of the things that are pump spells and just beef your team up. The Scale Up is one of those things that will probably get you some oohs and ahs. And yeah, I would just say maybe take the deck more in that direction and include more of the things that kind of get you that slow value, that draw, get an extra token once per turn or draw an extra 1 card per turn. The way that I built the deck is to be the most explosive and to just have that big turn where you cast 50 spells and take 30 minutes to pull out the win. I guess I should say the deck as it stands, the one that I built, I pointed this out at least a couple times. You generally don't have very many plays turn 1 or 2. There's only a couple spells that are super early. Turn 3, Cultivate is generally what you're looking for as a start. Nothing before turn 3 usually, and turn 3 all you're doing is ramping a little bit. So your thoughts might be that it's kind of a slower deck. The thing is that it starts out, it starts on turn 3, it just ramps for a few turns, maybe draws a little bit, puts out a few tokens. Then on turn 7 or 8 is when it just explodes and you're able to do tons and tons and tons of things. 9 feels kind of slow, but if you've been set back, if there's been a board wipe or some point, then yeah, turn 9 or 10 could certainly be where you're kind of slowed down to. But it very much is looking to explode off the chart. So it is a fairly strong deck. It's stronger than what a lot of you might be used to, what you're even looking for. If you wanted to slow it down, make it more casual, then the way to do that would be take out some of the explosive stuff, the things that make you a ton of tokens all at once, and instead just put in more of those combat tricks or combat buffs. So with that, thank you for joining me. Bye.